Welcome, May 28th, 2020. Welcome to Square One. I'm your host, Tommy K. We are talking about weird stuff about U.S. presidents, the middle years. We're going to start with Abraham Lincoln, and to bring you this information is your co-host, Tommy K., to tell you about number 16.
Did you know that the day Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, earlier he had signed the Secret Service into existence? The caveat being the Secret Service at that time wasn't necessarily the president's bodyguard, but it still is ironic to hear that today. Another interesting thing about Lincoln is that his son was saved by the brother of John Wilkes Booth.
Too bad they didn't have the Secret Service a couple of days ahead of time.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, it wouldn't have helped, actually.
I mean, yeah, technically it wouldn't have helped, but it's just interesting to think about from our modern perspective.
Well, how about that? Here's a word from our sponsor.
If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It's free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
That brings us to the Tennessee Taylor, the first president that didn't have a traditional education. He became a tradesman and learned to make his own clothing, which he made while he was president. He was also the senator of Tennessee during the Civil War and was the only southern state to not secede, which led him to become Abraham Lincoln's vice president, and that led him to become the president. And Johnson once said that God had Lincoln assassinated so he could become president. Ulysses, number 18, Grant. He was supposed to be in Lincoln's theater box the night of his assassination, but he had a last-minute change of plans, and he wasn't there. And it haunts him to this day. To this very day, he haunts the world.
He haunts the White House.
Because he thought he could have prevented it. Some of the more weirder things about Ulysses S. Grant is that he couldn't stand the sight of blood.
That's pretty interesting for a Civil War general.
Yeah.
Like the bloodiest war in American history.
Something cool about him is he dismantled the Ku Klux Klan during his presidency. Of course, they regrouped later. He fell, and that left him crippled. He also lost his entire fortune on a Ponzi scheme promoted by one of his sons. He died of terminal throat cancer after a lifelong time of smoking cigars. And that'll bring us to number 19, Rutherford B. Hayes. He was in the most disputed election ever. He lost the popular vote by about 250,000, but eked out an electoral college of one single vote. So, of course, that earned him the nickname Rutherford and his fraudulency. He was also called Granny Hayes because he didn't drink, smoke, or gamble. He eliminated booze at the White House, and his wife got the blame. They called her Lemonade Lucy, although she really had nothing to do with the decision-making, but she was anti-alcohol, if you may. And that brings us to James Garfield. He was ambidextrous. He could write in Greek with one hand and in Latin with the other hand. He was shot a few months into his presidency by an assassin and died 11 weeks later. Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone, tried unsuccessfully to find the bullet with an induction-balanced electrical device which he had designed, but the metal bed springs kept messing with the results and leading the doctors to cut into the wrong places. On top of this, the doctors also introduced bacteria into Garfield's body with their unsterilized prying fingers. On July 2nd, 1881, in a Washington railroad station, an embittered attorney who had sought a consular position shot the presidency. Mortally wounded, Garfield laid in the White House for weeks, and on September 6th, Garfield was taken to New Jersey Seaside, and for a few days he seemed like he was getting better, but on September 19th, 1881, he died from an infection and internal hemorrhage. That brings us to number 21, Chester Arthur. Chester Arthur, Elegant Arthur. He sold White House relics, like a pair of Lincoln's pants and 2 of Adams' hats, to remodel the White House. He was also the most forgotten president in history, according to Science. Throughout Arthur's political career, it was rumored, though never proven, that he had actually been born in Bedford, Quebec, Canada. His wife Ellen died in 1888, and Arthur entered the White House a widower. He became a bit of a dandy in his dress, they say. They called him a dandy.
Nice.
He liked to be in the fancy social circles in D.C., and he hated the dilapidated condition of the White House, so he had Louis Comfort Tiffany remodel it into like a fancy museum.
He basically sold off a bunch of priceless artifacts from former presidents so he could have a nicer house.
Yep. And that brings us to 22, Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland. His weird thing is that he became the legal guardian to his friend's 11-year-old daughter, and 10 years later was married to her, making her the youngest first lady ever at the age of 21, and making Grover Cleveland the Woody Allen of the 19th century. He was the first Democrat elected after the Civil War and our 22nd and 24th president. Grover Cleveland was the only president to leave the White House and return for a second term 4 years later. So his first term was 1885 to 1889, and then his next term was 1893 to 1897. So that brings us to 23, Benjamin Harrison. What's this guy? Oh, Harrison. Benjamin Harrison, the grandson of William Henry Harrison, the president who had goats running around. I think he was only president for like a month. He had goats and animals and told the speech in the rain, and it killed him. So this is the grandson of that guy. He was called the human iceberg, Benjamin Harrison, because he was stiff. But some people think maybe he was stiff because he was cold, but maybe he was just nervous. He was the first president to actually have electricity in the White House, and he was afraid to use the switches because he thought he'd get electrocuted. So the lights just stayed on all the time, even when he was sleeping. What else? Oh, he conducted the front porch campaigns, short speeches to delegates that visited him in Indianapolis. He was also short at only 5'6", not the shortest president, but tied for second. That will bring us to Grover Cleveland and his second administration.
Grover Cleveland was the first and only president in U.S. history to have served 2 terms, but they were non-consecutive. As in, he was president once, and then someone else was president, and then he came back and was elected again. He vetoed twice as many congressional bills as all 21 previous presidents, 414 vetoes in total. This is interesting because the first impeached president of all time was impeached because of how many times he vetoed bills, and yet here's Cleveland doing it just as bad, if not worse, so many years later.
But
interesting.
But even more weirder about him is that he had a jaw made of vulcanized rubber.
Yeah, he had a secret surgery on a friend's yacht.
That brings us to our final president of the middle years, William McKinley. William was shot twice on September 6, 1901, in the abdomen by a socialist anarchist named Leon. The president lived 8 days until his death on September 14, 1901, after leading the nation to victory in the Spanish-American War and annexing Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. He died. And Thomas, anything else you'd like to add?
Here's something really interesting about William McKinley. The man he ran against, McKinley was basically in the pocket of the robber barons of the era. And the man he ran against was a radical. These robber barons were terrified of him because he was antitrust. So they put him in the vice presidency, thinking it would keep him at bay, since at the time the vice president didn't really have any power. McKinley was, of course, assassinated, and the robber barons sealed their own fate because the next president was...
That's going to bring us to the end of our second podcast about weird stuff about U.S. presidents, and that's going to be in our next one entitled The Latter Years.
Years.
Thanks for listening.